Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Patricio Abinales, a professor at the University of Hawai'i in Mānoa, to talk about the historical perspective of some Filipinos regarding the former American presence in the Philippines. Dr. Abinales, thanks for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I appreciate
So,
it.
can you just start out by giving the audience an idea of what is your research? What is the scope of what you're studying? And what is the argument that you're trying to make?
Well, my specific research now is trying to understand something that I've been witnessing when I was in the Philippines. I grew up in the southern Philippines, and with the unusual high popularity of America among Filipino Muslims. And I was trying to figure out why was it. It started when I was doing my dissertation research. I was doing my field work, and my friend was trying to get me an interview with her 92-year-old grandfather, who was involved in a rebellion in 1975 against the Philippine government. But then when she introduced me to him, she said, well, you're Christian. I said, yeah. And he said, well, you're a slave. I said, what? It turns out that in the Spanish colonial era, you're familiar with Philippine history, Christians, especially from my hometown, neighboring that Muslim province, were slaves. They were always being raided by Muslim raiding parties. So, but then my cousin said, no, he goes to America. And he said, well, slave in America. And he looked at me and said, so when is General Leonard Wood coming to save us from the Filipinos? Now, this was 1990. Okay, he probably passed away now. I was shocked. He sat back and said, what is happening here? And he told a story. The southern Philippines for a while was dominated by Muslim communities. And when the Americans inherited the Philippines from the Spanish, they sent the army to govern the southern Philippines, thinking that these communities were uncivilized, backward, and savages, similar to Native Americans. And what happened was there was intense fight between them and these different communities that they're trying to control. But then what happens after the fighting, the soldiers became their teachers. And then the soldiers also began to set up the local governments that that was needed to sort of come out with a unified authority in that area. And but by 1913, the U.S. Army had to leave for several reasons. One, the U.S. Army was not the army that you have now. It's composed of different militias. Second, the civilians in Washington said, well, it's time for the Filipinos to rule now. This is a civilian-run government. What are you doing there? But one of the things that he remembered as a kid was this lieutenant who was running his town and saying, well, you know what? We have to leave now because by orders of Washington, because your Filipino politicians in the capital said we have to go. Well, they promise you when General Leonard Wood, the founder of the U.S. Army, becomes president in 1930, we will come back and break away the southern Philippines and turn it into Guam and save you from the Filipinos. And that got me really interested on the origins of this sort of strong pro-American sentiment when I was doing my dissertation. And I thought it was already gone. Then in 2008, went back to the same area. It had become a war zone, but USAID, United States Agency for International Development, was involved in the rehabilitation of its war zone. And the funny thing was, the USAID personnel I was with said, well, come with us. We'll put the flag. We have our van. We have our big SUV going around from one rehab area to another. And I said, aren't you afraid of kidnappings or ambush? He said, no. We fly the American flags. Americans don't get kidnapped here. the Chinese, the French, yeah, but the Americans not. And I said, this is again very funny because apparently the rebel group said, signed a peace agreement with the government in 1996, said, we would like the Americans to be part of this discussion in the peace process, in the negotiation of the peace process. So we want Malaysia, the Muslim country, to be involved in it, but we want the Americans to come in. And in fact, later on, one of the group leaders wrote a letter to President Bush saying, we had independence, we were a lot of revolutionary rhetoric, and then say, oh, by the way, can you mediate between us and the Philippine government? And the final story was in 2009, when I went back into the war zone because of my research, and there were American soldiers there because Southern Philippines is part of the tour of duty of American troops under a mutual military agreement with the Philippines. And I asked Muslim villages there and said, aren't you anti-American? Don't you think that Americans are, impinging on Philippine sovereignty? And the women in the one village said, no, it's okay. We can put the soldier there. I said, why? Well, the American soldier acts as a buffer between us and the Philippine Marines. If the American soldier is there, the Marines will not attack us. So that's the sort of research I'm trying to pursue now. Like, what is it in the light of Iraq and Afghanistan? Why was it that the United States, in a very quiet way, succeeded in its, in establishing its presence in the Philippine South? So that's basically what I'm researching now.
My next question is two parts leading off of what you had just said. First of all, in one aspect of your research and the materials you had sent me, you had noted that it was important when doing this research not so much to look at the Philippines on a national level, but to examine it on a local level. Can you go into why that's the case? And as an extension of that question, for people who are not all that familiar with the history of the Philippines, can you go into a little more detail about why certain populations actually wanted to see themselves as separate from the government in Manila?
Yeah. So again, the United States comes in here. The Philippines was colonized with the Spaniards for 250 years. In 1900, because of the Spanish-American War, it became a territory of the United States. The United States thought that the communities there were backward, uncivilized, needed to be civilized, but then only to discover there was the core of educated elites in the country, cosmopolitan, Spanish-speaking, some German-speaking. And then, if you remember, in 1900, there was really the kind of American politics that was prevailing then was a politics which was centered on local states. So when President McKinley issued a statement to American colonial troops there, colonial officers who were there, he said, well, the emphasis should be on the local government. The people tend to forget that the Philippine political system actually is very much a system that was modeled upon the idea of that in the United States, it's the local states that are more central than the federal government. The result of that then is a sort of a system that's similar to the US, where the executive is in the same power as the legislative. So the legislative, the Congress, the different kinds of legislative system that was set up the Americans and then became the legislative system after independence, were very much patterned after that, where you have local congressmen representing different districts coming together, writing laws, approving budgets, and basically in constant battle with presidents. Okay. So that's the first thing that people should understand. The country is it's a country where local politics really prevails. If you want to understand why the current president came to power, mayor jumps to the president, you have something to do with the way local politics evolve. So that's the first thing. Second is when the Spaniards controlled the Philippines for 250 years, the only area that they could not control was the South, where Muslim sultanates, Muslim political authorities, predated the Spaniards. And in fact, for about 200 years, was on the offensive against the Spanish. Okay, so when the Americans came in, inherited the archipelago as a legal entity, the two things they realized: they have to unite these people. Okay, and in the Philippine South, there are these Muslim communities that never considered themselves Filipino. The Filipino is a Spanish word from King Philip II. So they never really thought of themselves as that. They meant, there were sultanates, they were superior, they were more cosmopolitan, as I said. They're connected to Southeast Asia. They were trading with China, trading even as far as India. So why would they consider themselves that? So what the Americans really did, using firepower and collaboration, accommodating local elites, was to create a territory that was artificial. They did two things. One is a public education system where everybody learned English. Okay, so each dialects were allowed, each languages, local, that 120 or so Philippine languages were allowed to continue, but there was English as a public education. Now, English doesn't necessarily mean leading to national unity. Okay, so the Muslims learned their English, but also kept their languages and their religion intact. Never really thought of themselves as Filipinos. Second was when the Philippine government inherited the state from the Americans, they never really created a national textbook of which Muslims and all some of these communities were part of. In fact, if you look at Philippine textbook today, it's always focused on what's happening in the capital. Nothing happens in the third. There's not very little written about Muslims in the southern Philippines, the borders, the peripheries of the nation. Third is that because the Spanish were waging a war, mainly a defensive war against Muslims, one of the enduring legacies of the Spanish regime was this divide between Christians and Muslims. So Christian Filipinos think of themselves as civilized, okay, belonging to a part of the country that was more developed. Muslims were seen as backward, savages, warriors, not to be trusted. And that persisted even during the American period. Oddly perpetuated by the Army. The US Army realized by the end of the first decade of American rule, said, these guys are different, These guys are different. That's why they promised to return to save the Muslim Filipinos. And they became very paternal guardians of Muslims, which the Muslims also welcomed. And so that persisted, the different distinction persisted even today. So on the one hand, you have Muslims who saw Christians as attacking the religion, and vice versa. Second, you had a long history where the notion that you're not Filipino was ironically promoted and sponsored and nurtured by the Americans. So that sort of thing. I mean, even up to now, you still have communities in the South, despite the national media, which do not consider themselves Filipinos. It has its disadvantages if you're a politician a national politician, because all you have to do is negotiate, make accommodations, two backroom deals, and say, well, I'll protect you can run your turf, just give me the votes. But the disadvantage, of course, is a persistence of suspicions that they're not Filipinos.
Bringing this debate a little bit more into today's times, you talk about when you started this research, there wasn't too many others that wrote about this topic because, and I'm paraphrasing here, you said something to the effect of they wouldn't like the answer that they found. Can you talk about how this conversation of an American presence in the Philippines is currently playing out in today's political conversations? How contentious is it? And does this make its way into national debates often? And if so, what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, an enduring trend in Philippine history is really the idea that the Philippines has never been independent. The Americans granted them independence, whereas, say, Vietnam, Indonesia, these independence were fought against. And the Americans, 46, said, handed it out. And then through a series of treaties, that the Americans may have left the Philippines as a direct colonial governing body, but there was all these indirect controls that the U.S. exerted in a Republican Philippines. Military trade treaty, an unequal trade arrangement, a bias against American firms vis-a-vis Filipino firms. And so this theme has always been, we still are not independent. Okay. So, and then you have the Cold War, and then you have the youth protests in the 60s. And then Vietnam, of course, was a classic example, was often always seen as an example of an American superpower imposing its rule, okay, and failing. So the sentiment then is that the second, an accompanying trend to that, theme to that, is that all Philippine governments serve American interests. Okay. So if you were an academic in university, a student university, that's the kind of history you criticize. Or a lot of nationalist historians, and they're extremely popular, write their history books along this term. Okay. So you have this contradiction of intellectuals, students, and some political leaders of the country saying, this has to be resolved. Yet at the same time, ironically, because of the short but effective 40 years of American colonial rule, especially in the area of education, most Filipinos are pro-American. So what happened today is you have a president who was a product of that first anti-American tradition, went to universities when some of these nationalists were the teachers. and now, for a variety of reasons, including personal, he is articulating that anti-American position. Okay. At the other end, if you are familiar with the Pew Research, I think there was a research run about 4, 5, 6 years ago, asking which countries, which peoples are most pro-American. Filipinos ranked second after Israelis, and Americans actually came third. So you have a strong pro-American community, and then you have it as nationalist tradition that's going on. Which means then, if you want to study the Philippines, then the tendency is to look at this tradition from the capital, okay? Because they're the noises, no? The noises, or from the perspective of those in cities, okay? Easy. The South, it was a war zone, okay? It's Muslim, and Philippine media really didn't develop into a national network until the early 1980s. And so for most part, national news never really reached the part. So what persisted then is an oral history based on the past that they enjoy the most, the American colonial period. So that persists up to now. And what happens is, because it's complicated, because you say, well, you know what, in this debate between the two, the Muslims are, the Philippine South is completely different because they're pro-American, but they also want to leave the Philippines. Okay. Then the teaching of Philippine history becomes more complicated, no? Because how would you insert a people who never really believed in themselves as part of this national community, who's had a long history, actually an older history than the Philippine nation, and also expresses a sentiment that is pro-colonial, okay, at the time when the rest of Philippine history, especially in the leadership level, are becoming more anti-American. So you have this sort of tension that's going on now. And so, I mean, no historian, if you're a real historian in the Philippines, you have to consider that. If you take Philippine history seriously, that's it. You have to take the sentiments and the histories of these communities at the South into consideration. But then if you write about it, then it's not a neat, piece that you can write. There's always this tension going on.
Yeah, what I found so fascinating about your research was that, typically when we tell stories of American colonialism. It typically ends with having left a sour taste in that country's mouth, but here it seems to be looked upon positively. And because that's so different, what lessons can we take away from this history, whether they be more abstract lessons or practical lessons, when we read articles of history like yours or history books that talk about colonialism in the Philippines? In your mind, what are some of the most important lessons that we can learn from this particular aspect of history that you're researching?
I think the couple of things in terms of research method. I think oral histories are really important, especially in communities where there are no newspapers, people don't read. There's no no adequate support for educational systems. So those memories are important to consider, and not just be set aside and say, well, these are, memoirs are, a sentimental rememberings of a people. The second is to think about locals are important, localities are important, and that in a lot of cases, we read about national events that's happening in the capital, but actually in the long run, all these local stories can be more influential. Okay. The third is not all borders are backward. In fact, in Southeast Asia, and even suspect, in the North and Southern American continent, communities at the borders are actually an interesting group to study because they may be local, but they're also extremely connected to global or regional communities. I mean, just to cite a personal example, for me, for example, my first chocolate as a kid, growing up in a frontier town in the southern Philippines, was Cadbury chocolate. It's an American corporation now, but during my time, it's British. And so how did this hick from a small village gain access to Cadbury chocolate, which is extremely expensive in Manila, the capital? Something to do with the fact that the local community is also Muslim community, the one across where we live, across the bay where we live, is very much connected to Singapore, which used to be a British colony, which was for a while a distribution point of Cadbury chocolates. Okay, so people think of Hicks or people in the border as backward. In fact, they're not. One side research I've been doing, but was interrupted by COVID. I was trying to study smugglers in the Philippine South, and they speak 8 languages. So they speak Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Malaysia, the 3 Philippine languages, English, 9, and Chinese, Hokkien. So the question is, how can these people regarded as belonging to a dark area, supposedly backward, okay, uncivilized, speak 8 languages? And it's that kind of thinking, I think, that people should bring with them when they want to study a society's history. And so that's what makes me inspired as a historian. And in the Philippines, that's a classic case. Talking of Cadbury chocolates going to small villages in the south, but also like chopped, stolen Mercedes-Benz in Japan, ending up in the north. You're talking about rice from Vietnam smuggled into central Philippines, by Vietnamese ships with Philippine flags. And even when recently, chopped stolen cars in LA, ending up in the northern side of the Philippines, of Mindanao Island, this connection. So that's what I'm curious about. I'm less interested in what's happening in the center, often because they're more covered. So that's a sort of kind of curiosity I'm trying to promote, to sort of push for, even with my undergraduate students here.
And my last question before we finish up, and here's a chance for you to plug some of your work. If someone is listening to this podcast and they're more interested in learning about the Philippines or learning more about this topic, what would be some material or resources that you would recommend that they go check out?
Well, for colonial American experience in the Philippines, there's a lot of it actually. For the latest one on the American experience in the Philippines, quite critical is Professor Alfred McCoy's Colonial Policing. It it's an interesting, it tracks the origins of the Philippine police and looks at how Americans built it. But what's more interesting is Professor McCoy says, well, some of the things that the Americans did in the Philippines actually became the guide, the manual in which government offices like the FBI were set up. That's the first one. So second would be my wife and I wrote a textbook called State and Society in the Philippines, published by Roman and Littlefield. The idea, my wife was American from New Jersey. So when we wrote it, the idea was to can we write a textbook that my nephews in the Philippines and her nephews in the United States could read. If you're an undergrad course, you're writing an undergrad course in, say, Berkeley, and in the University of the Philippines, can this be a book that both Filipinos and Americans could use? And I have a Filipino American daughter, and now after my wife passed away, I said, this is a book for you. You have to figure out where you came from, but also this country, how much this country, the United States, has had a big role in the shaping of Philippine politics. So it's called State and Society in the Philippines, and interestingly, it has gained some readership in both sides of the Pacific. Some people like it, some people don't, but at least it's being read.
Dr. Abinales, thank you for taking the time to talk.
Thank you very much, Nakota, and good luck to your work. Fantastic work.
For those who are more interested in seeing more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you, Nakota.